Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Kitab al-Bay', the book of the sales transactions. There are 10 main chapters in this book, but before that, let us define what we're talking about. It is when you exchange wealth or service for wealth or service by way of transferal of ownership. Al-Bay' is legislated and permissible via the Quran, the Sunnah, and the Ijma' of the scholars, as well as sound qiyas. Authentically, the Prophet ﷺ said, رَحِمَ اللَّهُ رَجُلٌ سَمْحًا إِذَا بَاعَ وَإِذَا اشْتَرَى وَإِذَا اقْتَضَى. May Allah have mercy on the man who is easygoing when he buys, when he sells, and when he demands his debt back. Likewise, in the authentic hadith, in Ibn Majah and others, the Prophet ﷺ said, مَنْ أَنظَرَ مُعْسِرًا فَلَهُ بِكُلِّ يَوْمٍ مثله صدقة قبل أن يحل الدين فإذا حل الدين فأنظره فله بكل يوم مثله صدقة. Whoever gives respite to a person who is in straitened circumstances, then for every day of respite he gives, this person will have a sadaqah to his credit to the amount which is owed to him. And when the debt is owed, meaning the time comes to pay the debt back, and he again gives respite to the debtor, he will have twice the amount owed to him for every day he gives respite. From both of these narrations we find this idea of being merciful in your trade transactions. And besides, there are so many other narrations which talk about trade transactions. The first chapter in this particular book deals with conditions in a trade, and these are conditions for the trade to be valid. And we will look at 7 conditions. The first one is at-taradi, that both the purchaser and the seller should be happy and content with this trade. And this is as Allah Jalla wa Ala says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا لَا تَأْكُلُوا أَمْوَالَكُمْ بَيْنَكُمْ بِالْبَاطِلِ إِلَّا أَن تَكُونَ تِجَارَةً عَنْ تَرَاضٍ مِنْكُمْ. O believers, do not consume your wealth unjustly, meaning without due right, except that it be a trade by mutual consent. So we find you're not allowed to force anyone to purchase or sell anything, but you can get cases in which it is permissible to force somebody to sell, but this forcing is with due right. An example of this is the hijr made on a person. He is forced to sell his possessions to pay off the debt, and we'll talk about hijr a little later. Or what about a case when a person gives a pledge, a rahan, for a trade? If he is unable to pay the debt for the item which he has purchased, then the rahan can be sold forcefully. Condition number 2 is that both parties should be jaizut tasarruf. They must have the ability to conduct a trade transaction, and this happens when you are baligh, aqil, rashid, and hur. So baligh and aqil, you're an adult and you're of sound mind. Hur meaning you're a free person because a servant does not have any particular wealth to sell. And Rashid means somebody who is able to carry out trade contract. He will not be duped or conned, so that he will not waste his wealth. The exception could be made with children if they buy and sell things which are customarily normal for children to purchase and sell. The third condition is that the wealth which is being sold must actually be wealth, and that means to say it has a permissible benefit which can be reaped without there being a necessity for it or a particular need for it. So the meat of a pig, this does not have a permissible benefit. Of course, if you're dying out of hunger, then it is permissible to eat the meat, but this would be in a case of necessity. So what we're talking about is a benefit not in the case of a necessity nor a specific need. A specific need would be the hunting dog. The benefit of this particular item must be in the absolute sense. It must not be restricted to darura or haja. And fourthly, the item being sold must be the possession of the seller. Or if not, then you must be permitted to sell this item. So the owner must have given you permission to sell the item. The Prophet authentically said in the Sunan, لا تبع ما ليس عندك. Do not sell what you do not own. If a wakil, somebody acting on behalf of another, sells the item belonging to the owner without his permission, then after the sale, the owner agrees to this sale, then we say the sale is valid, otherwise it is not. Condition number 5, that you should be able to deliver the merchandise to the purchaser. Normally this condition is breached when there's gambling involved. So for example, if a person says, I sell you the bird flying in the air, well, he has to catch it first. He may not catch it, so you're not sure that you'll be able to deliver it to the purchaser. Normally they'll do this and lower the price. So if there's risk involved, the price will be lowered than if you were to sell the bird in a cage where you know you can deliver it to the purchaser. So you can see the gambling there. The purchaser is going to pay less amount of money because there's a risk that he may not obtain this bird. But if he does obtain this bird, then he has obtained an expensive bird for a very cheap price. So it could go either way for him, and it could go either way for the seller as well. And number 6, the price of the commodity must be known. And the Prophet forbade bay'ul gharar, a trade of jeopardy or risk. This is when you do not know, for example, what the price is, or what the product is like, or whether you're going to even receive the product. All of this is gharar, or jeopardy. And so the 7th condition we can give is that the commodity must be known, meaning its description. Because again, like we said, if the commodity is unknown, then this becomes a bay'ul gharar, which is prohibited, as it leads to dispute, enmity, hatred, ill will. The commodity can be known either by simply looking at it, or at least it must be described in sufficient detail so as to prevent any argumentation later on. The Hanbali madhab also add another condition. They say that the trade transaction must not be hinged on a future event, because that future event may happen or may not happen, which would render this contract to be a bay'ul gharar. However, this can be disputed, and it can be argued that hinging the trade on a future event is permissible. So if you say, I sell you this car when Ramadan begins, then the car is sold at the beginning of Ramadan, and you do not need to renew the contract. The Hanbaliya will say, no, you need to renew this contract at the start of Ramadan, and that first contract does not count for anything. So those were the conditions. Now let us look at types of trade which are haram. We'll go through 30. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are examples. So the first one is a contract in a masjid. And we have authentically in Muslim and others that the Prophet said to us that when you see somebody selling or purchasing in a masjid, then say, La arbah Allahu tijaratak. May Allah not put profit in your trade. And if you see somebody announcing their lost property, then you say to them, La raddah Allahu alayk. May Allah not return it to you. So this is making dua against such people. And it is a ta'zir, because making dua against such a person definitely is a type of punishment for them. But is the trade valid? You can argue the trade is not valid because the Prophet has forbidden the trade in a masjid. So therefore its presence is like its absence. Other scholars could argue that the trade is valid, but you're doing that which is haram. But practically speaking, we do not trade in a masjid. The second one is trading after the adhan on Yawm al-Jum'ah for the one on whom Jum'ah is wajib. So we're talking about the adhan before the khutbah. Allah Jalla wa Ala specifically tells us to hasten to the remembrance of Allah, that is the khutbah, and to leave off the trade. So therefore a trade at such a time, its presence will be like its absence. What about this situation? The seller says, I sell you the item for £10. And then the adhan begins, and then the purchaser says, yes, I accept. Is such a trade valid? The answer is no, because the acceptance happened after the adhan. So this acceptance, its presence is like its absence. And you cannot have a trade unless it is by the acceptance of the purchaser. Thirdly, selling against the sale of your brother. The Prophet directly forbade this. Do not sell against the sale of your brother. Even though the word brother is used, This also involves a dhimmi because a dhimmi does have some sanctity to him. His blood, his wealth, and his honor must be respected. And we also say that such a trade, its presence is like its absence, because it is in direct violation of the prohibition. And what we mean by selling against your brother is if a person sells an item for £10 and then you butt in and say, I'll sell you a similar item for £8, and the purchaser purchases from you. So you see how this is going to create enmity between you and the other seller because you stole, in effect, his trade. It's the same thing with purchasing against the purchase of your brother, where you basically offer a higher price for the same product. And so you deprive your brother of that item. And fourthly, we have the bay'ul gharar, the transaction of risk. This is a transaction in which you do not know what you're receiving, or that if you do know what you're receiving, you do not know what it looks like, its description. Or it could be that the price of the item is unknown. So you can see the risk involved in such a trade. However, having said that, there are instances in which a small amount of gharar does not harm. And in fact, sometimes you do not even have a choice. So if you purchase an orange, you do not actually know what the orange is like inside. It might just be corrupted. You may have a fair idea, but there is an amount of risk involved. And with other matters like vegetables which are pulled out of the ground, there is a part of that food which is unknown because it's underneath the ground. But this type of small amount of gharar will not render the transaction invalid, and you can safely overlook it. Fifthly, the bay'ul hasa, the sales of a pebble. What does this mean? There are various examples. For example, the seller says, I will throw a stone, and wherever the stone lands, I will sell you that item. So maybe he's in a clothes shop and he says, whichever clothing this stone lands on, I'll sell you that item for such and such an amount. So this is risk involved. You can see it has the essence of gambling because definitely there is a risk. The proper way would be that the purchaser takes the clothing, inspects it, maybe tries it on in a fitting room and then decides. That's the proper way of doing it. Not in accordance with where the pebble lands. For example, he might say, I'll throw the stone, and wherever it lands, that piece of land from here to the landing place of the stone will be yours for such and such a price. So you can see the risk and the jeopardy and the gambling involved in this type of a trade contract. And sixthly, bay'ul mulamasa. Lamasa means to touch. And how does this work? Well, the purchaser touches an item of clothing without inspecting it and trying it on. And whichever item of clothing he touches will be his for such and such an amount. This is definitely gambling because he might touch an item of clothing which is worth much and he takes it for a little amount. Or he could lose out. He may be paying a great deal of money for an item of clothing which is not worth much. Seventhly, we have the bay'ul munabadha. Munabadha means to hurl something. And this is where the seller will hurl an item of clothing or whatever the commodity is to the purchaser, and whatever he hurls will be sold for a particular agreed upon price. So in a case like this, if say the price is £20, the seller is going to hurl an item of clothing which is worth less than £20 because that way he makes a nice profit. The hurling can be done by either the seller or the purchaser. The point is that the clothing has not been inspected and tried on, which would be the normal way to purchase an item of clothing or any other item for that matter. But with the mulamasa, there is no inspection and there's just gambling. And eighthly, bay'ul habl al-habala, the child of the child. What's all this about? This used to happen in the Jahiliyyah, whereby a person buys a dromedary, a she-camel, on delayed payment. But when is he going to pay for this item? He's going to wait until this she-camel, the dromedary, gives birth to another she-camel, and then that she-camel, which has been born, gives birth. That will be the time of payment. So in other words, the grandchild of the first dromedary. You can see, no doubt, that the gharar here is big and substantial. And ninthly, selling the sperm of the male animal. So a person who owns a male camel, let's say, charges a person who owns a dromedary for the male camel to mate with the dromedary so that the dromedary may give birth. You are not allowed to charge for such a price, because essentially what you're doing is that you're selling the sperm of the male camel. And it does not have to be a camel, of course, we are just giving an example. These are the types of matters which should be done for free, meaning to say, the ma'un, which Allah Jalla wa Ala speaks about, little helpful matters, which should be done for free. Tenthly, we have bay'u ma laysa indak, selling what is not your possession. What is not in your possession, then the problem is you do not know if you will be able to deliver such an item. Number 11, bay'ul 'ina. And this is a little trickery to make riba halal. Let's explain it. Person A sells a computer to person B for £500. And this is to be paid for after 1 month. Then immediately person A purchases back this computer for £400 paid in cash right now. In other words, the computer returns back to person A. Now after a month passes, person B, of course, owes person A the £500, which he pays him. So do you see what's happened here? It is as if person A gave £400 in cash right now to be paid back £500 after 1 month. Of course, you know that is riba. And this sales contract, quote unquote, is just a little device to make it look halal. And in the Sunan, the Prophet expressly forbade such a sales transaction, and he said that humiliation will overcome you if you deal with such a transaction, and it will stay with you, meaning this humiliation, until you return back to your deen. And number 12, two sales contract in one contract. The example they give would be the seller saying, I sell you this computer on the condition that you sell me your phone. So these are two contracts but under the umbrella of one contract. The Hanabila say that this is haram because we have narrations in which the Prophet forbade two contracts in one contract. However, it needs to be said here that when the Prophet spoke about two contracts in one contract, what he meant was a type of contract which makes the haram into halal, such as the bay'ul 'ina. That's two contracts in one contract. As for saying that I will sell you my computer on the condition that you sell me your phone, then there's nothing inherently wrong with such a contract, and it would be allowed, contrary to the Hanbali madhab. And the 13th one is selling anything which is haram, such as alcoholic beverages, or statues, or pork, and so on. And 14th, selling fruits before they become ripened. In the Sahih, the Prophet forbade this. As for the sign of when the fruit is ready to be eaten, then this varies from fruit to fruit. And for the grains, it's when they become hardened. Because before that, there is a chance that blight would afflict it, and it would become unconsumable. So you would have wasted your money if you bought it at that time. It is, however, permissible to buy such fruit if you're going to give it as fodder for your animals, because then that would be a definite and permissible benefit. And the 15th one, selling a dog. And this is all types of dogs, even a hunting dog or a guarding dog or a sheep dog or a dog to protect your farm, because the prohibition authentically is general. And the 16th, selling food or any other item for that matter before taking possession of it. And Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma said about selling food before you've taken possession of it, he said that they're actually just selling gold for gold and the food is held back. So a person buys food for £10, before ceasing possession of it, he sells it on for, let's say, £12, making a £2 profit. So this is selling what is not in your possession, and even profiting from what is not in your possession, and that is haram. The Prophet forbade that you should make a profit out of that which does not come under your guarantee. And many mortgages, the so-called halal mortgages, work in this way. They're profiting out of that which does not come under their guarantee. In other words, they will not suffer its losses. And the 17th, Bay'un Najash. Najash is when you excite a game animal to run away. And Shar'an, it means to increase the item of a commodity, not in order to purchase it, but in order to harm the potential purchaser. And the Najish, the one who tries to raise the price of the item, does so in order to excite interest in the item, just like exciting a game animal to run. The Prophet directly forbade the Bay'un Najish. And the reason for that is because it brings about harm to the purchaser. And then number 18, a townsperson selling on behalf of a nomad or a countryside dweller. And this happens when a townsperson meets a trade caravan coming in from the outside, and he says to the trade caravan, look, let me sell your item on your behalf. Now, why would he do that? Well, it's because people from outside the town do not know what the going rate is. And so it is easy for the people in a town to haggle the price down. Whereas a person already from the town knows what the going rate is, and it will be harder to haggle the price down from him, meaning from the townsperson. Now, one opinion on the matter is that if the outsider approaches the townsman to sell on his behalf, then that is permissible. Although it has to be said that the prohibition in the narration is general, so it would not make a difference as to who meets whom. And the scholars also talk about the fact that this item being sold must be a necessary item. If it is just a luxury item, then yes, the townsman can sell on behalf of the outsider. But again, the problem is that the prohibition is general, and it is more worthy to stick to the generality of the narration. And also, it does not make a difference whether the townsman sells on behalf of the outsider for a payment or not. Again, the narration is general. One can also argue that if the outsider knows the going rate just like any other townsman, then such a deal is permissible, that the townsman can sell on behalf of the outsider, and this would be just like any other wakala contract. Because in a case like this, the people in the town will not be harmed, as there will be no difference between the townsman selling or the outsider selling. But to be on the safe side, the townsman should not sell on behalf of the outsider. So in order to strictly adhere to the prohibition. According to the majority of the scholars, such a trade, even though it is prohibited, would be correct. So it would be valid, because the trade per se is not forbidden. Rather, what is forbidden is harming the other people, because they're going to have to purchase it at a higher price than they would ordinarily have to had they been purchasing from the outsider. And on to number 19, Bay'ul Musarra. And this is when you tie up the udder of the animal so the milk builds up, and so it seems like that this animal is going to give much milk, which will obviously make it desirous in the eyes of the purchaser. The Prophet says that if something like this does happen, then the purchaser has a choice. Within 3 days, he is allowed to return the animal with 1 sa of dates. So we take from this that the sales contract itself is valid, because the purchaser has the choice to go along with the trade. Had it been invalid, then the purchaser would have no choice. He would have to return the item. And this idea of showing your merchandise in a positive light is called tadlis. So you show it in a light which makes the purchaser desirous, but in reality the item is not as beautiful as it is made out. And number 20, Bay'u Thunya. And this is when you make an exception in the trade. So you say that I will sell you this many sheep from the flock except a few. So how much is a few? That is unknown. So you see the gharar involved here because the exception made is unknown. So the Prophet forbade this type of trade unless you make known what the exception is, so that the purchaser purchases your item upon insight, not upon ignorance. So you can say that I will sell you this box of grapes except 10 grapes. That is an exception and that is fine. But you cannot say I will sell you this box of grapes except a few, because we do not know how much a few is. And number 21, بيع المحاقلة والمزابنة. Muhaqala and muzabana are similar. So muhaqala pertains to the crops growing from the ground, and muzabana pertains to the dates which grow on the date palm trees. So muhaqala is grains still in the air to be sold for grains outside the air. Now, of course, you do not know how much grain there is inside the air, but you do know how much grain you have outside the air. That's in your hand, so you know how much it is. So to exchange such a thing would have to be done by estimation, and that would be riba, because you have to exchange a like amount, because if you do not, that becomes riba. As for muzabana, then you have dates on the date palm tree, and these are succulent dates, they have not dried yet, and you exchange these for dried dates. Now, when the dates dry, of course they change in their size, as you can imagine, and so to exchange succulent dates with dried dates, it's impossible to get the measure equal for equal. And when you exchange dates, they must be equal for equal in measure, otherwise it would be riba. And we can make an analogy with other fruits as well. So you have grapes, and then dried grapes are called raisins. So you're not allowed to exchange grapes with raisins, because again, it is impossible to say that they are equal in measure because they change in their size. And when the amount is unknown, then it becomes riba. You have to exchange like for like when it comes to ribawi items of the same type. The exception given to the muzabana is the bay'ul araya, which allows you to exchange dried dates for succulent dates as long as the amount you're exchanging is less than 5 awsuq, which is 300 sa'. So for example, a man has, let us say, 5 sa' of dried dates, and he has no money. This is a condition. He must not have any money, and yet he wants to purchase succulent dates. So he goes to the owner of the succulent dates with his 5 sa' of dates, and then they make an estimation. How many of these succulent dates, if they become dried, would amount to 5 sa'? This is an estimation which they make. And after having made this estimation, they exchange the dried dates for the succulent dates. The purchaser of the succulent date is not allowed to take these succulent dates home, rather he has to eat them there and then. And note the condition here that he only has dried dates to pay with. If he has something else to pay with, then he must resort to that. And the exchange must be less than 5 awsuq, which is 300 sa'. The exchange must be made on the spot, so there must not be any deferred or delayed payment. Also from the conditions, the estimation must be made. How much would the succulent dates be worth if they are dried? So how much sa' would they be worth? And also, like we said, he is not allowed to take these succulent dates and leave them until they become dried. This is haram. Rather, he has to eat them as succulent dates. And when we say that he has to eat them straight away, what follows on from this condition is another condition, that the succulent dates must be on the tree. They must not have been picked off the tree and put in some sort of container. Then the araya is not permissible. Rather, the succulent dates must be on the tree so that the purchaser picks them off the tree and eats them. Okay, let's reverse the roles. What if the owner of the succulent dates wants the dried dates? Can you make a similar exchange in this way? One opinion says no, you cannot, because the exception is made for the muzabana and you cannot make an analogy when it comes to the exceptions. The other opinion says it is permissible, because in both cases you are fulfilling the need of the one who needs the dates, be it dried dates or succulent dates. And Allah knows best, but perhaps the weightier opinion is the second one, that the role reversal is permissible, because it's all about fulfilling the need. Another disputed matter is, can we have the araya for other than dates? So for example, grapes. Dried grapes are raisins. So can you exchange raisins for grapes with the same conditions of the araya which we spoke about? Again, you have two opinions from the scholars. One opinion says no, a qiyas cannot be made. The other opinion says yes, a qiyas can be made. And again here, the favorable opinion would be the second one. It's more flexible. We say yes, a qiyas can be made. Because again, we have a case of a need being fulfilled. And number 22, selling a cat. The Prophet ﷺ in Sahih Muslim forbade selling a cat. However, most scholars say that a cat is permissible to be sold if it will serve a benefit, such as chasing rodents away. And they say that the narration which talks about the prohibition is talking about a cat which does not serve any particular purpose. Having said that, of course, no one disagrees that it is permissible to give a cat as a gift to somebody, or even a permissible dog can be given as a gift, but not sold. And number 23, exchanging meat for an animal. In the collection of Al-Hakim, the Prophet forbade selling a sheep for meat. He also forbade selling a dead animal for a living one. And also, he forbade selling meat for an animal. What's apparent from the narrations here giving the prohibition is that even the types can be different. So for example, selling cow meat, which would be beef, for a live sheep, that would be impermissible as well. So the type of animal does not matter. That is what is apparent. Number 24, Bay'ul Mu'awama. This comes from the word am, which means a year. And this is where the seller would say, I sell you all the fruits from this tree for this year. The problem is, we do not know how much fruits this tree will produce, and so therefore there is a great amount of gharar involved. And number 25, exchanging two ribawi items of the same type for unequal amounts. An example would be 5 sa of poor quality dates for 3 sa of good quality dates. Now the quality does not matter when it comes to riba. It's purely the quantity which matters. So ribawi items of the same category, such as selling dates for dates, must be of the same quantity. Number 26, selling two ribawi items of the same type on delayed payment. So for example, 5 sa of poor quality dates being exchanged for 5 sa of good quality dates, that's fine because the amounts are the same. However, if you have delayed payment in this contract, so for example, the good quality dates are to be paid 1 week from now, then that would be haram. It would be riba al-nasi'a, the riba of delayed payment. And number 27, exchanging an animal for another animal on delayed payment. So for example, the seller says, I'll give you this sheep, and in return, you give me another sheep tomorrow. This would not be permissible according to the narration which prohibits such a transaction. Now this narration in the Sunan is authentic. However, we say it is shadh because it opposes a more authentic narration in which Abdullah ibn al-As took one camel from the camels of Sadaqah and replaced them with 2 camels. The reason for doing this is because they needed some camels for a military expedition, so they took from the camels of Sadaqah. So based on that then, you are allowed to exchange an animal for an animal on delayed payment. Number 28, selling food before it has been measured twice. What does that mean? Well, certain foods are measured using the makil, such as dates and so on, so this is the sa. When you're selling, for example, dates, you measure them out using the makil. So if you purchase dates, the seller is going to measure the dates out using the cup, which is called the makyal, and he scoops them up, so he measures the dates before giving them to you. Now, if you go on to sell these dates, then you yourself have to measure the dates out by scooping them up with the mikyal and checking their measure. You are not allowed to say, well, I'm selling you the same amount of dates, so there's no need for me to measure them. No, you must measure them before selling them. In Sunan Ibn Majah and others, the Prophet forbade selling food until 2 sa'as have been measured on it. And number 29, selling excess water. What we're talking about here is public water, which everyone has access to, so shared water. We are not talking about private water, such as the ones shops sell in their fridge. They have bottled water, be it mineral water or whatever else. This is private water that can be sold, but public water, which is for everyone, the public, cannot be sold. So when we're talking about public water, like public well and so on, then the one who comes to it first may make use of this water, and whatever is left is not allowed to be sold. You must leave that alone for others to come and make use of. Also, we have another scenario. Supposing you own a well, and this well is in an open place. And in this open place, there is a public grazing land for the people of their sheep and other cattle. The problem is, in order for the shepherds to graze their animals will need to drink from your water well. Now, if you prohibit them from drinking from your water well, the shepherds will not be able to graze their animals, because animals cannot graze without drinking. So what is upon you, the owner of the well, is to let the animals drink from the well for free. Authentically, the Prophet said, لا تمنعوا فضل الماء لتمنعوا به الكلى. Do not prevent others from drinking from your excess water, because in that case you would prevent people from grazing their animals. So we say it is obligatory upon you to give away the excess water for free, subject to the following conditions. That your water is the only one available in that particular grazing land. Secondly, that you give the water for the grazing animals. This water does not need to be given for pasture growth, because you are not responsible for making the pasture grow so that the animals may graze. So look at the difference. And thirdly and finally, that the excess water is actually excess. In other words, it is not water that the owner of the well actually needs, because if you need it, then of course it is your well and you have priority. And number 30, selling an unknown amount of food for a known amount when the food is of the same type. Now we said food, strictly it's not any food, it is the ribawi type of food, which is the food which is measured using the mikyal, or food which is weighed. So for example, apples are not ribawi items. So the type of food we're talking about would be dates and other such ribawi items. So you're not allowed to sell a heap of dates, and we do not know its measure, for a known quantity of dates, because when you exchange dates, they must be of equal amount, otherwise it would be riba. The prohibition for this type of transaction is found in Sahih Muslim. Now let us move on to another section of the bay', which is the khiyar, or a choice which you have to annul the contract. The first one of this is called the khiyarul majlis, which is the right to annul the contract at the place where you've concluded the contract. So if it is a shop, for example, you can annul the contract in the actual shop. But if you leave the shop and then come back in wanting to annul the contract, then you have no right. The wisdom for this right which you have been given is that oftentimes when you purchase an item, you may feel regret, because when you do not have an item, it appears more desirous to you. But when you actually have it in your possession, it does not appear as desirous, and you may even regret purchasing it. So the Sharia does give you that flexibility to annul the trade, but it has to be there and then. Meaning as long as you're in the same place of the contract. Question: who defines what the place of the contract is? And the answer is the customs. Also, the Prophet forbade us from deliberately leaving the place of the contract so as to prevent the other person from exercising his right to the khiyarul majlis. So here your intention matters. And secondly, we have the khiyar al-shart. And this is where a person would say that I'll purchase this house from you, but I want to have 3 days within which to be given the right to annul the trade. And that is permissible if they both agree. The time limit can be extended before the 3 days are out. But when the 3 days are out, then the trade becomes absolutely binding and you're not allowed to annul it. And thirdly, we have the khiyarul ghaban, the choice of ghaban. What is ghaban? This is when the seller sells you an item for far, far higher than the going rate. If the purchaser finds out that he has been conned in this way, he has the choice. Either he can keep with the trade or he can annul it and take his money back. And note the condition that if he is conned, we're assuming that he did not know the going rate. As for if he knew the going rate and still accepted this trade, then he has no excuse and therefore no right to annul the trade. And also when we say being conned and being charged extortionately, then all of this is governed by the customs of your land. And also when we say being conned, we mean at any time when you're conned and are charged an extortionate price. The Hanbali madhab restrict the ghaban to 3 particular types, but it is more worthy to say that whenever you do not know the going price and you are conned extortionately, then you have this right to annul the trade. And fourthly, khiyarut tadlis. We spoke about this before when we talked about tying up the udders, but is when you show an item in a desirable light, where in reality it is not so desirable. You could, for example, have a beat-up car and you put some paint on it, showing it to be a modern or a new car, whereas in reality it is not. So this is tadlis, and it is a type of deception. Note here that in this type of the right of annulment, you either keep the item as it is, or you return it and take your money back fully. You are not entitled to any indemnity payment. Let us take some review questions. Question number 1. Recall the list of the conditions for a trade to be valid. Question number 2. Give the condition for the bay'ul araya to be correct. Question number 3. What are the 3 conditions making it obligatory upon you as the owner of the well to give the water away for free to the grazing livestock, which is owned by other people?